Good afternoon. How are you? Well, you know, the temperature's good. Jefferson delivered in that score. It's 51 degrees, but it is overcast. It is gray. Look how sorrowful it is out here. And I don't hear my birds. Even they think it's uncomfortable. They're sitting on a tree somewhere eating a couple of things they scavenged earlier, I'm sure. So the humidity's in the 30s, and they say another cold spell is coming next week. We'll see. And the wind's at 7 miles an hour, but it's not affecting me here. We have had this terrible, terrible collision over the waters of the Potomac that have resulted in a plane full of people, some outstanding competitive ice skaters, and family members and people you and I don't know, in a plane that collided with a helicopter. The waters of the Potomac were more than ice cold. I think they said it was 0 degrees. There were hundreds out trying to get people as quickly as they could. One of the lessons of cold water after a collision are obvious. And so now they're in a process of recovery, and everybody's asking who did what and what could have avoided it and so forth. Now, well, there's no other way to say it except to say that felon Trump has asked the question in such a way as to say this wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for DEI. Diversity, equality. You know, this guy is so hateful. Now let me go back a little bit on my own experience about this stuff. After I was a federal prosecutor, I worked for a time in a very fine law firm. A lot of people clerked on the Supreme Court. It was originally founded by FDR Jr., the firm was. And one of the largest clients was in the airline industry. And because I was considered a trial attorney, they put me in the middle of the trial portion of the air traffic controller strike on behalf of the airlines. Now, the air traffic controller strike, among other things, was about how unsafe the system was, putting planes and persons at risk because of the system that they had. And they could have done what's called a work and rule, which is to say that they insist on following all the safety protocols. But the membership of PATCO felt very strongly that this time they had to strike. Now, these air traffic controllers were federal employees and then were not allowed to strike. And there are other ways to bargain, but they'd had enough. And Bob Poli, whom I ultimately deposed and so forth, pretty much described how they had thought the government had done enough to them. Now, I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of the labor dispute, but we had advised our clients, and when I say we, in this case, I'm talking about the senior partner, Herb Prashker, who handled these accounts. And all the named airlines in the United States were involved. And Reagan wanted to fire all the air traffic controllers. And our counseling was against that because they were needed to the system. You can't get rid of that kind of institutional knowledge and experience. And the problem wasn't with the workers. The problem was with the system. So, go forward, and we have this incident with the air traffic over Reagan National Airport. Now, that airport has shorter runways. It has much too much traffic. In fact, Congress tried to increase the traffic more than it was. And we We don't have enough information to say much about the two different entities, but suffice it to say, there have been questions about enough staffing and the equipment and so on. And the system back in 1981, was entirely self-contained, meaning it was a separate system. And now I'm sure it's not that. And I'm sure it's better. But you need to have sufficient staff. And blaming air traffic controllers for something that sounds a lot more complicated. I know in the helicopter there was a training mission, and the people in the copter on this training mission were wearing night vision glasses. I don't know how that affected their ability to see when they flew. Of the two instruments in the sky, the plane with 60-something passengers was navigating for landing. So they didn't, I would guess, we'll find out in the days ahead, they wouldn't have the mobility in the air to deal with that. Now, a helicopter would. Supposedly there was a radio report that the helicopter did see the plane. So there are missing pieces here. But the failure to avoid a collision had nothing to do with the race of the people involved. And this is as much an instruction of how important it is to have the best and the brightest in a government, instead of those who are part of the spoil system of a felon who manages to steal by lying and distrust, if not the actual rules by which we conduct elections these days. He puts our nation at risk. And that's the way he sees it. If we're criticizing the government, he's going to claim, see, it was those other guys. There was a story today as well that, they were curtailing the mobility and viability of the FAA. Everybody's going to be pointing fingers, so it's hard to make a judgment. But the one judgment we can make without question is that this is not about race. And to suggest that we don't have the best and brightest air traffic controllers is the terrible slander. And it says to people across America that maybe we're not taking care of you in the air. And this particular airport is very difficult. And people argue to use it for convenience when they want to put too much traffic on it to make it safe. And there have been people talking on and off during the day while I've been writing. I've heard it in the background. And experienced pilots are talking about how you have to have game on when you're coming into that airport. So it'll take some time for us to get the information on it. But as you may know, they lay out all the pieces of the plane and investigate it. And they choose a large space to do so. Now, years ago, I took a flight, it was 80 or 81. I took a flight, the shuttle, from DC at that airport to New York. But when I got in the plane, it was snowing and there was ice on the wings. And they did what they do to the wings, but they still looked frozen when we took off. And the climb was, it seemed steeper to me, but I was never meant to fly. Although I thought at one point I wanted to be an astronaut. After Sputnik as a kid, I thought, hell, that's better than magic. That's science. But the science is unforgiving. And our plane took off, and I got to New York. And at the time, I was married to a woman who was a broadcaster with ABC, Bettina Gregory. And it turned out that a plane crashed into the Potomac that day. And people were in the water, and the stories about it were just terrible. And she reported on it from D.C. So I was on one of the planes that went out of the airport that day without problems. But there's a lot of criticism about should the flights have been allowed. There are several lessons to take away from this. The answers as to the specific incident, the terrible loss of talented, wonderful people who thought they were innocently just arriving into town, gone. But what we've done here that's really wrong is Trump has been commenting without evidence as to what's going on. And that's tempting, but but it's dangerous too, because lives, reputations, remedies, all of that has to be considered. And if you had to guess, you would say the selfish people on the Hill would say, my plane won't blow up, or whatever, and they'll keep the traffic high. So what's a person to do in Virginia? Go to Dulles, obviously, or go up to Baltimore. So here I am saying the same thing, but you can't ignore what needs to be done and understood before we can move forward, and we will. The worst thing about today, after the terrible death and loss, and the people grieving, is that we're not maintaining our services. And we listen to people that have an appetite for something that's convenient but not safe. That's one of the things I'm sure we're going to find out here. Another thing is there are too many helicopters in that region, in that area. And it'll be fascinating and scary to find out how they deal with that kind of a question. And then to suggest that it has to do with the race or the people who are appointed to these positions without regard to ability. If you've ever been at one of these centers, you'd see that that is just so unfair and horrible, but it is the mark of the man, felon Trump. So you may gather from my rambling that I'm reacting as much to the history of what I've observed as to the loss of people here. And one of the things we're going to have to drill down is what are the requirements for this system to work right and safely, and what are the limitations? There have been incidents in which planes didn't have enough runway, ran off the runway. Not with any disasters, but that's what can happen. And if we had to duplicate this, what are these agencies going to do? HHS and FDA, and what are they going to do? FAA, what are the alphabet soup agencies going to do under this administration that provides for the kind of care and safety and management that probably prompted what happened today? Could be just a perfect storm. 5 things happened that have never happened before, and that's how this happened, this terrible, terrible disaster. So, think about those poor people who've left behind these survivors to suffer the loss of people that literally meant their lives to them. So, here I am with this sorrowful remembrance and comment in the Cathedral of Trees. People just don't understand. Mother Nature is unforgiving if not respected. Taking a heavier than air machine up in the air and putting several around them, it's got to be done carefully. All the best. Bye-bye.